5. Money and measures. A greatly misunderstood law is Leviticus 19:35-37 concerning honesty in measurements. Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord. The word judgment here refers to all that follows. Meat yard was a measure of length or surface, that is, yard, cubit, foot, and the like. Weight had reference to the talent, shekel, and other weights of money. Measure refers to measures of capacity, the homer, ephah, hin, etc. Balances means scales and weights. Ephah and hin cites again the forms of measurement already listed. That weights means money has long been known. Fairbairn's Imperial Standard Bible Encyclopedia, like others, discusses the shekel under the classification of quote-unquote weights. The Bible speaks of money as a weight. For example, we are told that David gave to Ornan for the place 600 shekels of gold by weight. 1 Chronicles 21:25. Opinions differ as to the exact nature of the talent, mina, shekel, beka, zuzah, reba, and gera, but Bonar's table of weights is perhaps as good as any. The shekel was probably half an ounce, avoir du poids weight. Bonar has been referred to deliberately because he is also the author of a commentary on Leviticus. In commenting on Leviticus 19:35-37, he devotes 3 pages to a basically evangelistic homily. In 2 sentences, he refers to the specific point of the text to say, quote, in markets, in trade, in their shops, in meting out land with the yard and cubit, or weighting articles in the balance, or trying the capacity of solids. The balances and its weights, the ephah, and its subdivision, the hin, must be strictly exact. End quote. It is possible to speak of the studied irrelevance of much preaching and comment on Scripture. A law of central importance to the monetary and economic morality of a nation is treated casually, or not at all. The biblical materialism of the Jews prevented them from being so irrelevant. The Talmud thus noted, quote, Rabbah said, why did the divine law mention the exodus from Egypt in connection with interest, fringes, and weights? The Holy One, blessed be He, declared, It is I who distinguished in Egypt between the firstborn and one who was not a firstborn. Even so, it is I who will exact vengeance from him who ascribes his money to a Gentile and lends it to an Israelite on interest, or who steeps his weights in salt, or who attaches to his garment threads dyed with vegetable blue and maintains that it is real blue. End quote. The point here is that the firstborn or elect of God are those who abide by His law. Those who have outwardly enjoyed the privileges of the covenant and a covenant culture, but who deny its laws, are the subject of a special vengeance from the covenant God. C.D. Ginsburg also referred to this aspect of the law and cited its enforcement during the time of the Second Temple. Quote, It will be seen that the lawgiver uses here exactly the same phrase with regard to meting out right measure which he used in connection with the administration of justice in verse 15. He, therefore, who declares that a false measure is a legal measure is, according to this law, as much a corrupt judge and defrauds the people by false judgment as he who in the court of justice willfully passes a wrong sentence. Owing to the fact that men who would otherwise disdain the idea of imposition often discard their scruples in the matter of weights and measures, the Bible frequently brands these dealings as wicked and an abomination to the Lord, whilst it designates the right measure as coming from God Himself. Deuteronomy 25:13 and 15, Ezekiel 45:10 and 12, Hosea 12:7, Amos 8:5, Micah 6:10 and 11, Proverbs 11:1, 16, 11, 20, 10, and 23. According to the authorities during the Second Temple, he who gives false weight or measure, like the corrupt judge, is guilty of the following 5 things. He 1. Defiles the land. 2. Profanes the name of God. 3. Causes the Shekinah to depart. 4. Makes Israel perish by the sword. And 5. To go into captivity. Hence, they declared that the sin of illegal weights and measures is greater than that of incest, and is equivalent to the sin of denying that God redeemed Israel out of Egypt. They appointed public overseers to inspect the weights and measures all over the country. They prohibited weights to be made of iron, lead, or other metal liable to become lighter by wear or rust, and ordered them to be made of polished rock, of glass, etc., and enacted the severest punishment for fraud." End quote. This law has therefore a number of very important implications. First, the old Latin and modern laissez-faire principle, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is not biblical. Dishonest merchandising is as serious a matter as dishonest judges and courts. At this point, the modern liberals have been closer to biblical requirements than conservatives have been. The supposed evolutionary law of the jungle is not biblical morality. On the other hand, the liberal principle, let the seller beware, is not biblical either. The law cannot encourage irresponsibility on the part of either buyer or seller. Laissez-faire countenanced irresponsibility by the seller. Liberalism and socialism encourage irresponsibility by the buyer. Honest goods are necessary, but also honest payments. The state, as the Ministry of Justice, does have a duty to maintain justice in the marketplace, but it cannot confuse justice with charity. True, the state, as the policeman, can be corrupt. In fact, if the society as a whole is corrupt, the state will also be corrupt. In a healthy and godly society, the state will function successfully to restrain the minority of evildoers. The key to the situation is not the state, but the religious health of the society. The law specifically states that false weights and measures are unrighteousness in judgment, or injustices in matters calling for justice. Since justice is the ministry of the state, these are matters for the state to adjudge. Second, meat yards are measures of length or surface of yards, feet, inches, cubits, meters, and the like, including acres, as we have noted. Justice requires the maintaining of strict standards in these matters, and the penalizing of those who defraud by means of false measures. Frauds in this area involve frauds in land transactions, in goods and materials, and in a variety of ways basic to commerce. Third, fraud in weights is essentially fraudulent money. Very obviously, biblical money was by weight, a weight of silver or of gold, and every form of coinage in later times was by weight. Earlier, money was not by minting or coining, but was a piece of silver or gold of a specific weight. The gold coinage of the United States followed the biblical pattern by establishing itself with reference to weight, the ounce, 0.900 fineness, or fractions of an ounce. Fractional reserve banking, unbacked or partially backed paper money, and inflation of money by debt and credit is thus a violation of this law. Isaiah, in listing the charges in God's bill of indictment against Jerusalem, declared that thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water, Isaiah 1:22. The reference is to false weights, silver replaced with baser metals, or heavily alloyed with them, and to false measures, a quart of wine made into a gallon by mixture with water. Thus the law clearly requires the condemnation of all fraudulent money. The law of the guilty bystander thus clearly condemns all ministers, priests, and teachers who do not declare the sentence of the law against fraudulent money. Their silence means a guilt comparable to that of corrupt judges or of counterfeiters, in that they counterfeit God's word by their silence or by false interpretations. As surely as a false yardstick or a false cup measure defrauds a man, just as surely a false money defrauds a man. Even worse, dishonest money introduces a false weight into every monetary transaction in a society, so that radical corruption and injustice prevail. If in every business transaction in any society a basic fraud prevails in the form of dishonest and counterfeit money, then the entire society is polluted, honest men are robbed, and thieves prevail. This is precisely what monetary fraud and inflation perpetrate, the triumph of thieves over godly men. Silence in the face of such radical corruption is an inexcusable ignorance and an evil. Ginsburg, above, cited the texts condemning false weights. They are declared to be an abomination to the Lord. As witness Solomon's declaration, diverse weights and diverse measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 20, verse 10. Diverse weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. Proverbs 20, verse 23. In Ezekiel 45, 9-12, God specified the exact ratio of the shekel to its lesser and greater weights, as well as dealing with balances and measures of capacity. The lack of justice here, God through Ezekiel termed violence and spoil, as well as exactions. Fourth, measures here in this law refers to measures of capacity, and the law required strict honesty here as elsewhere. Liquid and dry measures alike are covered by this law. We have noted Isaiah's condemnation of watered wine. A gallon of wine which has been watered may provide an accurate gallon, but it is still dishonest because its contents have been mixed with water. Fruit, watered shortly prior to marketing, gives a dishonest weight and lesser flavor. Cows given salted feed in order to make them drink heavily and increase their weight represent fraud, as do forms of trucking cows to the sales yard, which will dehydrate them and reduce their weight. Fraud thus extends beyond the scales or the bushel basket. Fifth, just balances refers to what is today called weights. Honest scales are basic to just commerce, and the regulation of scales is thus basic to the ministry of justice. The poor in particular are victimized by dishonest balances. Amos 8:4-8. They are least able to protect themselves and suffer the most from the consequences. Sixth, the consequences of violations of this law are apparent in the land itself, which will cast out the people. Even as the Nile floods Egypt, so judgment shall sweep over the people. Amos 8:8. The law is emphatic on the relationship of this law to life. Thou shalt not have in thy bag diverse weights, a great and a small. Thou shalt not have in thine house diverse measures, a great and a small. But thou shalt have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Deuteronomy 25:13-15. This statement has been well noted by Luther, who observed that, quote, a just weight and just measure should be preserved in the community, so that a poor person and one's neighbor are not cheated. This also has general validity for all exchanges of all contracts, that the seller give just and equable wares for the money of the buyer. Here greed knows unbelievable injustices and tricks in changing, cheapening, imitating, and adulterating merchandise. Therefore, it is no small part of the concern of government to have an eye here to the common good. End quote. Luther is clearly right. The commandment thou shalt not steal plainly forbids changing, cheapening, imitating, and adulterating merchandise, and such fraud or theft is no small part of the concern of government. But the culminating point is too often neglected, the promise of life for obedience to this law, as well as the fifth commandment. Conversely, life is denied to those who violate this law. A land given to theft faces judgment and death. In other words, God shortens the life of the nation that condones shortchanging and defrauding by fraudulent money, scales, and other measures. Calvin said of Leviticus 19:35, quote, now if the laws of buying and selling are corrupted, human society is in a manner dissolved, so that he who cheats by false weights and measures differs little from him who utters false coin. And consequently, one who, whether as a buyer or seller, has falsified the standard measures of wine or corn or anything else, is accounted criminal. End quote. The Reformers, like the earlier Church Fathers, were not silent with respect to this law. In evaluating this law, it is important to set it in the context of the legal tradition of the modern era, in order to understand the basic conflict of principles. The legal tradition can be divided into three basic positions. First, a principle of the older liberalism and more recent conservatism joins the concepts of laissez-faire and self-interest. Non-interference by the state in economic affairs is required, and it is held that the self-interest of all individuals adds up to the public good. Caveat emptor reigns, and no attempt is made to enforce this Levitical law. This position clearly posits the rule of the individual as well as his ultimacy in the social order. The self-interest of the individual leads to the greatest good of the greatest number of people. Second, the new liberalism as well as socialism affirms the rule of the state. The self-interest of the state leads to the greatest good because the state has the welfare of all the people at heart. Legislation is therefore necessary to enforce honest weights and measures. In the first, there is no protection for men and society from the sin and rapacity of men. In the second social order, there is no defense for men against the power and depravity of the state. Third, biblical law declares the rule of God and his law. God's self-interest is alone the true foundation of law and order. God, as all holy, righteous, and just, does most wisely decree and govern all things. Only as men are redeemed and submit, by grace and or by compulsion, to God's law order can there be justice. If God's law is not respected, then neither men's self-interest nor the state's self-interest can preserve the social order. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Psalm 127, verse 1.